6 months later, Oloku sat in the waiting room of Lagos University Teaching Hospital, holding Folake's small hand as they waited for the doctor to call her name. The back wages from Chief Balogan's shut-down construction site, combined with compensation ordered by the Labor Ministry, had finally provided enough money for his daughter's surgery. Her leg, twisted since birth, would soon be straight and strong. The journey from that confrontation at the construction site to this moment of hope had not been easy. After the site closure, Oloku had faced weeks of uncertainty about employment and the future. Some workers had blamed him for their job losses, arguing that steady exploitation was better than unemployment. Others had thanked him for giving them the courage to demand dignity in their work lives. Amika had helped him find work with a different construction company, one that followed proper labor laws and treated workers as human beings rather than disposable tools. The wages were fair, the working hours reasonable, and safety equipment was provided without charge. Oloku discovered what it felt like to work with pride rather than desperation, to come home each evening tired, but not broken. The new job also connected him with other workers who had faced similar challenges. Together, they formed an informal network that shared information about fair employers and warned against exploitative operations. Word spread through the construction community about sites to avoid and foremen who treated workers badly. Chief Balogan's name became synonymous with the kind of exploitation that workers should never accept. Aduni had traveled from their village to Lagos for Folake's surgery, bringing Kemi and their youngest son, Tunde, with her. Seeing his family together in the city where he had suffered and struggled gave Oloku a profound sense of completion. The sacrifice had been worth it, not just for the money, but for the lessons learned about standing up for justice. "Papa," Folake said softly, "will the surgery hurt very much?" Oloku squeezed her hand gently. "It will hurt for a little while, my daughter, but then you will be able to run and play like other children. You will be able to go to school without pain and become anything you want to become." The doctor called Folake's name, and the family stood together. As they walked toward the operating room, Oloku reflected on the changes that had occurred since that morning when he had shouted, "Enough!" at Chief Balogan. The word had seemed to release something powerful into the world, a force that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of dozens of other workers. Several of his former colleagues had found better employment after the construction site closure. Kunle had returned to Kano and started a small construction business of his own, treating his workers with the respect they deserved. Sei had used his experience to gain admission to a technical college, studying to become a proper engineer. Bello had found work that allowed him to spend time with his twin babies, watching them grow during their crucial early months. The Labor Ministry inspection had also led to broader changes in construction industry oversight. More surprise inspections were conducted, worker safety regulations were enforced more strictly, and a hotline was established for reporting exploitation. Chief Balogan's case became an example used in training sessions for labor inspectors, showing how systematic abuse could be hidden behind legitimate business operations. But perhaps the most important change was in the workers themselves. Men, who had accepted exploitation as inevitable, began to understand that they had rights and dignity that no employer could take away. The story of the construction site rebellion spread through Lagos's vast network of laborers, inspiring others to demand fair treatment and refuse to accept abuse. 3 hours after entering the operating room, Folake emerged with her leg in a cast, but her face bright with hope. The surgeon reported that the procedure had been completely successful and that within a few months she would be able to walk normally for the first time in her life. That evening, as the family celebrated in their small hotel room, Aduni took her husband's hand and looked into his eyes with deep gratitude. "You did it," she said simply. "You saved our daughter." Oloku shook his head gently. "We all did it together. The other workers who stood with me, the inspector who investigated the site, even Chief Balogan in his way, everyone played a part in bringing us to this moment. Kemi, now back in school and excelling in his studies, looked up from the book. He was reading. "Papa, when I finish my education, I want to help workers like you did. I want to make sure no one has to suffer like you suffered." This declaration filled Oloku with pride that went beyond his daughter's successful surgery or his own victory over exploitation. The lessons of courage and justice were being passed to the next generation, ensuring that the cycle of positive change would continue. A year later, Oloku received an unexpected visitor at his new construction site. Chief Balogan arrived, looking humbled and worn, his expensive clothes replaced by simple work clothing. The criminal charges against him had been dropped in exchange for paying all back wages and fines, but his reputation in the construction industry was destroyed. "I came to ask for work," the former foreman said quietly. "I know it sounds impossible, but I have learned from my mistakes. I want to earn an honest living with my hands, the way you and the other men did." Oloku studied the man who had once seemed so powerful and cruel. He saw genuine remorse in Chief Balogan's eyes, along with the humility that comes from losing everything and starting over. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Oloku replied. "But if you work here, you work as an equal among equals. No special treatment, no shortcuts, no looking down on other workers. Can you accept that?" Chief Balogan nodded, his former arrogance completely gone. "I understand. I just want to work honestly and feed my family." Watching his former oppressor join the crew as a common laborer, Oloku reflected on the strange turns that life could take. Justice was not always about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation, about giving people the opportunity to become better than they had been. Folake ran to greet her father when he returned home that evening, her steps sure and strong, on legs that worked perfectly. She had become the fastest runner in her school, making up for years of being unable to participate in physical activities. Her joy was infectious, spreading to everyone around her like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. As Oloku tucked his daughter into bed, she asked him to tell her again about the day he stood up to the mean foreman. The story had become her favorite, not because of the conflict, but because of the courage it demonstrated and the positive changes it had created. "Remember, my daughter," Oloku said as he kissed her forehead goodnight, "when something is wrong, sometimes one person saying enough can change everything. But you must be prepared to stand for what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous." Folake smiled sleepily. "I will remember, Papa. And if I ever need to say enough, I will. Be brave like you were." Outside their small but comfortable home, Lagos continued its endless dance of commerce and dreams, struggle and hope. In construction sites across the city, workers labored under better conditions because one man had found the courage to refuse exploitation. The ripples of that single word, enough, continued spreading outward, creating waves of positive change that would touch lives for generations to come. "Enough!" bellowed Oloku, his voice cutting through the chaos. Chief Balogan had been screaming threats and insults for 10 minutes, his face purple with rage as he promised to destroy the lives of every man who dared oppose him. His words poured out like toxic water from a broken pipe, threats of blacklisting, promises of arrest, descriptions of the poverty and suffering that would befall their families when word spread about their rebellion. But Oloku's single word, delivered with the authority of a man who had found his true strength, cut through the foreman's tirade like a machete through tall grass. The construction site fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the buzzing of flies around. The blood stain near the cement mixer. Chief Balogan stared at Oloku with shocked disbelief. Never in his years of exploiting desperate workers had anyone dared to silence him so directly. The psychological power structure that kept 40 men subservient to his will had cracked like a dam under pressure, and he could feel his authority, flowing away like water through the breach. "Did you just tell me to shut up?" he whispered, his voice deadly quiet. Oloku stepped closer, his worn work boots crunching on the dusty ground. "I told you enough. Enough threats. Enough lies. Enough treating human beings like disposable tools. We have listened to your words for months, and your words are empty promises wrapped in cruelty." The men behind Oloku stood firm, their solidarity visible in their straight backs and determined faces. Even those who had initially remained with Chief Balogan began shifting uncomfortably, realizing they were on the wrong side of history being made. "You want to know what enough means?" Oloku continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Enough means Taiwo died for your profits, and you threw his body away like garbage. Enough means David lost his fingers because you forced him to work when he could barely stand. Enough means we sleep 40 men in a room while you live in comfort built with our sweat." Chief Balogan tried to regain control of the situation. "You are nothing without this job. You are just ignorant village people who should be grateful for any work at all." But his words had lost their power. The spell of fear and intimidation that had kept these men trapped was breaking like old rope under strain. Kunle, the giant from Kano, spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "We built this building with our hands," he said slowly, his deep voice carrying across the site. "Every bag of cement, every steel bar, every block was lifted and placed by us. Without our labor, you have nothing but empty land and broken promises." Other workers began finding their voices. Say spoke about the engineering skills he had learned on the job, knowledge that made him valuable to any construction project. Bello described the long hours he had worked without complaint, the dedication he had shown despite receiving wages that barely fed his family. Chief Balogan realized he was losing the psychological battle, so he switched tactics. "Fine. You want better conditions? I can give you better conditions. The wage cut is canceled. No more 18-hour days. Better food in the canteen. But this rebellion ends now, and everyone goes back to work immediately." The offer hung in the air like smoke, and Oloku could see some of the workers wavering. Improved conditions would make their lives easier, and the promise of canceled wage cuts addressed their immediate financial concerns. But he had learned something important during his months of observation and suffering. Promises from Chief Balogan were worthless unless backed by genuine accountability. "What guarantee do we have?" Oloku asked. "Last month you promised safety, equipment that never arrived. You promised fair wages that were reduced through mysterious deductions. Why should we believe your promises now?" Chief Balogan's confidence returned slightly. "Because I am telling you the truth. I am a businessman, not a monster. Sometimes business requires difficult decisions, but I can be reasonable when workers show proper respect." Emeka stepped forward, his thin frame belying the strength in his voice. "Respect is earned, not demanded. You have shown us no respect, so why should we respect you? You speak of being reasonable, but your idea of reasonable is 40 men living like animals while you prosper." The foreman's patience finally snapped completely. "You ungrateful fools! I should call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing and conspiracy. You have no rights here. This is my property and you work under my rules." This threat revealed the fundamental truth that Oloku had been trying to help his fellow workers understand. Chief Balogan saw them not as human beings with dignity and rights, but as property to be controlled and disposed of at will. The temporary concessions he had offered were tactical retreats, not genuine changes of heart. "Call the police," Oloku said calmly. "Let them see the conditions we work under. Let them examine the quarters where 40 men sleep in a space meant for 20. Let them ask why David lost his fingers and why Taiwo died in his sleep. Let them investigate whether you have been paying proper taxes on our wages or following labor safety regulations." The mention of regulations and investigations caused visible alarm in Chief Balogan's eyes. Construction sites that operated on Exploitation usually violated multiple laws, and official scrutiny was the last thing he wanted. His business model depended on staying invisible to authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about working conditions and wage practices. At that moment, a black sedan pulled up outside the construction site gates. 3 men in suits stepped out, carrying briefcases and clipboards. They showed identification to the security guard and walked purposefully toward the confrontation. Chief Balogan's face went pale as he recognized them, representatives from the Lagos State Ministry of Labor, conducting one of their surprise inspections. "Mr. Balogan," called the lead inspector, a tall man with graying hair and steel-rimmed glasses, "we are here for a routine inspection of working conditions and wage compliance. We received some reports that required investigation." The timing seemed almost miraculous to Oloku, as if their stand for justice had summoned official intervention. Later, he would learn that Emeka had quietly contacted a cousin who worked in the ministry, but in that moment, it felt like divine vindication of their cause. Chief Balogan tried to recover his composure, but his voice cracked with nervous energy. "Of course. Welcome to the site. Everything here is completely legal and above board. These workers were just having a small disagreement about work schedules." The lead inspector looked around at the assembled men, noting their malnourished appearance, worn clothing, and the obvious tension in the air. His experienced eyes took in details that told a story different from Chief Balogan's cheerful welcome. The blood stain near the cement mixer, the unsafe scaffolding, the overcrowded workers' quarters visible in the distance. "We will need to examine your employment records, wage payment documentation, and safety compliance certificates," the inspector announced. "We will also need to interview workers privately about their experiences here." Oloku felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. Official intervention could lead to justice, but it could also result in the site being shut down, leaving all the workers unemployed. The other men shared his uncertainty, shifting nervously as they realized their rebellion had attracted consequences beyond their control. Chief Balogan made one last attempt to maintain his authority. "These inspections are unnecessary disruptions to productive work. My workers are happy with their conditions, and any complaints you may have received come from troublemakers who were dismissed for poor performance." The inspector's expression remained neutral and professional. "That may be true, Mr. Balogan, but we still must conduct our investigation according to proper procedures. Workers have the right to safe conditions and fair wages, regardless of their previous employment status." As the day progressed, the inspection revealed the systematic exploitation that Oloku and his fellow workers had endured. Safety violations were documented, wage records were examined and found inadequate, and living conditions in the workers' quarters were deemed substandard for human habitation. But the most powerful testimony came from the workers themselves. When interviewed privately, they spoke with voices that months of oppression had not completely silenced. They described the impossible working hours, the inadequate food, the dangerous conditions that had cost David his fingers and Taiwo his life. By evening, Chief Balogan's construction empire had crumbled like poorly mixed concrete. The site was temporarily shut down. Pending corrections to safety violations, back wages were ordered to be paid immediately, and criminal charges were being considered for the most serious violations of labor law. Oloku stood outside the construction site gates as the sun set over Lagos, watching Chief Balogan drive away in his SUV for the last time. The man who had seemed so powerful that morning now looked small and defeated. His authority revealed to be nothing more than the temporary advantage of exploiting desperation. The workers faced an uncertain future, but it was a future they would face with dignity intact and justice partially served. Some would find employment on properly managed construction sites. Others would return to their villages with enough back wages to restart their lives, and a few would use their experience to help other workers avoid similar exploitation. Dawn broke over the construction site with an oppressive humidity that made the air feel solid. Oloku woke before the work bell, his body tense with anticipation of what the day would bring. Around him, 39 other men stirred reluctantly from shallow sleep, their faces bearing the accumulated exhaustion of months under Chief Balogan's ruthless schedule. Word about David's accident had spread despite efforts to keep it quiet. The young man's blood still stained the concrete near the mixer, a dark reminder of the price of exhaustion and negligence. Some workers crossed themselves when they passed the spot, while others simply looked away and continued with their tasks. Fear hung over the site like morning fog, thick and suffocating. Chief Balogan arrived later than usual, stepping out of his air-conditioned SUV with the confident swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. He wore a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, his appearance a stark contrast to the dirt-stained, exhausted workers who had already been laboring for 2 hours. His first stop was the damaged cement mixer, where he spent several minutes examining the machinery and shaking his head in theatrical disappointment. "Gather around!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the construction site. "All workers, stop what you are doing and come here now!" The men assembled reluctantly, forming a loose circle around their boss. Oloku positioned himself near the front, feeling his heart pound against his ribs like a trapped bird. Emeka stood beside him, along with Kunle, Seye, and Bello, the men who had shared their quiet conversations about change and justice. Chief Balogan began his speech with characteristic arrogance. Yesterday's accident was caused by carelessness and laziness. David was not paying attention to his work, and now we all suffer the consequences. The client who visited last night was not impressed with our progress, and he is considering taking his money elsewhere. Murmurs rippled through the assembled workers, but Chief Balogan raised his hand for silence. Therefore, new rules take effect immediately. Anyone who causes damage to equipment will have the repair costs deducted from his wages. Anyone who gets injured due to carelessness will be dismissed without pay. Anyone who cannot keep up with the work schedule should find employment elsewhere. The injustice of these pronouncements hit Oloku like physical blows. David had lost 2 fingers because he was forced to work through exhaustion, not because of carelessness. The equipment was old and dangerous because Chief Balogan refused to invest in proper maintenance. The work schedule was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal compensation. Furthermore, the foreman continued, due to the client's dissatisfaction and the costs of yesterday's damage, this month's wages will be reduced by 20%. This will teach everyone to be more careful and work harder. The silence that followed this announcement was like the quiet before a thunderstorm. 40 men absorbed the reality that their already inadequate wages would be cut further, that their families would receive even less support, that their sacrifices were being used to justify additional exploitation. Oloku felt the moment crystallize around him like water turning to ice. Every conversation with Emeka, every memory of Folake's brave smile despite her pain, every letter from Aduni hoping for his success, every injustice he had witnessed over 3 months, all of it converged into a single point of absolute clarity. He stepped forward from the group of workers, his voice carrying clearly across the construction site. No. Chief Balogan looked at him with surprise, as if a piece of equipment had suddenly spoken. "What did you say?" "I said no," Oloku repeated, louder this time. "We will not accept a reduction in wages that were already too small. We will not accept responsibility for accidents caused by unsafe working conditions. We will not continue to work 18-hour days for 8,000 naira per month while you profit from our suffering." The foreman's face flushed red with anger and disbelief. In 3 years of running this construction site, no worker had ever challenged him so directly. The other men watched in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing heroism or suicide. "Do you know who you are talking to?" Chief Balogan demanded, his voice rising. I am the one who gave you work when no one else would hire you. I am the one who provides food and shelter for your worthless lives. Without me, you would be begging on the streets." Oloku stood his ground, feeling strength flow through him from some deep source he had never accessed before. "You did not give us work. You bought us like slaves. The food you provide is not fit for animals, and the shelter is a prison where 40 men sleep like sardines in a can. You have grown rich while we have grown sick and weak." "Get back to work immediately," Chief Balogan commanded, "or collect your things and leave this site forever." This was the moment Oloku had prepared for, the choice between submission and resistance. He looked around at his fellow workers, men with families depending on them, men with dreams of better lives, men who had endured months of abuse because they had no alternatives. "We all leave together," Oloku declared, "or we all stay and work under fair conditions. You cannot fire all of us and complete this project on schedule. You need us more than we need you." Chief Balogan laughed, but the sound was strained and artificial. "There are hundreds of men outside these gates who would gladly take your jobs. You are all replaceable." Emika stepped forward to stand beside Oloku. "Then replace us. But first explain to your client why the project will be delayed for weeks while you train new workers. Explain why the men with experience and knowledge of this building are walking away." One by one, other workers began moving forward. Kunla's massive frame cast a shadow over the foreman as he joined the growing group of men standing with Oloku. Sei, despite his youth, walked forward with steady determination. Bello hesitated for a moment, thinking of his newborn twins, then stepped forward as well. Within minutes, 35 of the 40 workers had joined the group facing Chief Balogun. Only 5 men remained in the original circle, their fear of unemployment stronger than their anger at the injustice. The foreman's confidence began to crack like poorly mixed concrete. His voice took on a threatening tone as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "You people are making a very big mistake. I have connections in this city. I can make sure none of you ever work construction again. I can have you arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace." Oloku felt the collective strength of the men behind him, and it filled him with courage he had never known he possessed. "Then do it. But first, let us see how you explain to the police why David lost his fingers, or why Taiwo died in the workers' quarters, or why men are collapsing from heat exhaustion while you sit in air conditioning." The standoff stretched like a taut rope between two powerful forces. Chief Balogan's authority, built on fear and desperation, faced the collective will of men who had finally decided they would endure no more abuse. The morning sun climbed higher, heating the air and the tension between the two groups. Then Chief Balogan made the mistake that would change everything. His anger overcame his judgment, and his voice rose to a roar that could be heard across the entire construction site and beyond the gates where other workers waited for employment opportunities. The third month brought a heat wave that turned the construction site into an furnace of suffering. The concrete absorbed the sun's punishment during the day and radiated it back at the workers like a malevolent spirit. Men collapsed regularly from heat exhaustion, but Chief Balogan's solution was simple: replace the fallen workers with fresh bodies from the endless supply of desperate men who arrived daily seeking employment. Oloku watched good men crumble under conditions that seemed designed to break human spirits. Taiwo, a gentle carpenter from Ibadan, developed a persistent cough that grew worse each day until he could barely speak. When he asked for time off to see a doctor, he was told that absent workers were unemployed workers. Taiwo continued working, his cough echoing across the site like a sad drumbeat, until one morning he simply didn't wake up in his bunk. The other workers found Taiwo's body still and peaceful, as if he had finally found the rest that life had denied him. Chief Balogan's response was characteristically heartless. The body was removed by midday, Taiwo's belongings were thrown into a garbage bag, and a new worker occupied his bunk before sunset. No one spoke of memorial services or contacting his family. Taiwo became a ghost, remembered only in the whispered conversations of men who feared they might suffer the same fate. This death changed something fundamental in Oloku's heart. The patient endurance that had sustained him through 2 months of exploitation transformed into a burning anger that grew stronger each day. He began to see clearly how the system worked. Desperate men were consumed like fuel to Power Chief. Balogun's profits then discarded when they could no longer contribute. The foreman slept in an air-conditioned trailer while his workers suffocated in overcrowded quarters. He ate restaurant meals while they fought over scraps of rice. Oloku started talking quietly with other workers during their brief rest periods. He discovered that every man had a similar story: promises made and broken, wages reduced through mysterious deductions, working conditions that violated every principle of human dignity. But more importantly, he found men whose anger matched his own. Amika became his closest ally in these conversations. Despite his thin frame, the man possessed a sharp intelligence and a network of contacts throughout the construction industry. He knew which sites paid fair wages, which foremen treated workers with respect, and which projects had been completed using the same exploitative methods they endured daily. The problem, Emeka explained during one of their evening talks, is that we compete against each other instead of standing together. Chief Balogun knows that for every man who complains, 10 others wait outside the gate hoping for work. Our desperation is his greatest weapon. Other workers gradually joined their discussions. Kunle, a massive man from Kano who could carry 2 cement bags where others managed 1, spoke about construction sites in Abuja, where workers were paid on time and provided proper safety equipment. Say, barely 20 but wise beyond his years, described labor unions in other countries that protected workers from exactly the kind of treatment they endured. "But how do we change anything?" asked Bello, a quiet man whose wife had recently given birth to twins. "If we complain too loudly, he will fire us all and hire new people tomorrow. Then our families starve while we make our point." This was the central dilemma that kept 40 men trapped in their misery. Individual resistance meant individual destruction, but collective action seemed impossible when survival depended on keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. The breaking point came during the 4th week of Oloku's 3rd month. Chief Balogun announced that an important client would visit the site, and the work must be completed ahead of schedule to impress the visitor. This meant 18-hour days with no additional compensation, working through the night under floodlights that attracted swarms of insects and created an otherworldly atmosphere of shadows and sweat. The pace became inhuman. Men stumbled like zombies between the concrete mixers and the building framework, their bodies operating on pure willpower while their minds shut down from exhaustion. Several workers began hallucinating from sleep deprivation, seeing things that weren't there and talking to people who existed only in their fevered imaginations. On the 3rd night of this marathon, a young worker named David fell asleep while operating a cement mixer. His hand was caught in the machinery before anyone could react, crushing 2 fingers so severely that they had to be amputated later at a public hospital. David's screams cut through the night air like a siren, waking everyone on the site and creating a scene of chaos and blood that would haunt Oloku's dreams for years to come. Chief Balogun's response to this tragedy revealed the true depth of his callousness. Instead of expressing sympathy or taking responsibility for the unsafe working conditions, he berated the injured worker for damaging equipment and disrupting the construction schedule. "Stupid boy!" he shouted at David as the young man lay bleeding and sobbing. "Now who will pay for the repairs to the mixer? Who will make up for the lost time? This is what happens when people cannot stay awake and do their jobs properly." Something snapped inside Oloku as he watched David being loaded into a taxi that would take him to the hospital. Not an ambulance, because Chief Balogun refused to pay for proper medical transport. The combination of rage, exhaustion, and moral revulsion created a moment of perfect clarity. He could not continue to be complicit in this system of abuse. That night, as the workers finally collapsed into their bunks after 20 hours of continuous labor, Oloku made his decision. He would not wait for the perfect moment or the ideal conditions. He would not calculate the risks any further or worry about the consequences. Tomorrow, when Chief Balogan arrived for his morning inspection, Oloku would speak for every man who had been broken by this system. Emeka noticed his friend's transformation. "Brother, you have the look of a man who has decided something important. What are you planning?" Oloku looked around the quarters at 40 exhausted men, most of them too tired to remove their work clothes before falling onto their thin mattresses. These were good men, fathers and sons, dreamers and survivors, human beings who deserved dignity and fair treatment. They had families depending on them, just as he did, but their current situation helped no one except Chief Balogun and his wealthy clients. "Tomorrow," Oloku said quietly, "things are going to change. I don't know how and I don't know what will happen to us, but I cannot watch another man die for Chief Balogun's profits." Emeka gripped his friend's shoulder with understanding and solidarity. "Then we change things together, brother. No man should have to stand alone against this kind of evil." As Oloku finally closed his eyes that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving in Lagos: peace. The decision to act had lifted a weight from his soul that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Tomorrow would bring consequences. He couldn't predict, but at least he would face them as a man who chose to fight rather than a victim who simply endured. 3 weeks into his employment, Oloku began to notice cracks in the promise that had brought him to Lagos. The workdays stretched longer than the agreed hours, often extending past sunset without additional compensation. Chief Balogun would appear at 5 in the evening, just as the workers prepared to clean their tools, and announce that they needed to finish pouring concrete for another section before stopping. "The rain might come tomorrow," he would declare, pointing at clear skies. "We cannot afford delays. Real men work until the job is complete." The workers had no choice but to continue, their bodies screaming for rest, while their minds calculated the extra hours they would never be paid for. Oloku's hands began to develop permanent calluses, and his back developed a constant ache that followed him into sleep. But he endured, thinking of Folak's medical bills and his family's empty grain store back home. The food provided at the site barely qualified as meals. Watery rice with a few beans, served twice a day from large aluminum pots that always seemed to run empty before everyone was fed. The workers who arrived last to the serving area often went hungry, and Oloku learned to rush from the work site when the dinner bell rang. His body, accustomed to Aduni's carefully prepared meals and the occasional chicken from their small flock, began to weaken under the combination of heavy labor and poor nutrition. Money became a source of growing anxiety rather than hope. When Oloku asked about receiving an advance to send home for his daughter's medical needs, Chief Balogun's assistant, a thin man called Segun, laughed as if he had told a joke. "Advance? Brother, this is not a bank. You work the full month, then you collect your pay. That is how business operates." But when the end of the first month arrived, payday brought new disappointments. Chief Balogun gathered the workers in the courtyard and began calling names from a notebook, handing out envelopes with cash amounts that seemed smaller than expected. When Oloku's turn came, he opened his envelope to find 8,000 naira instead of the promised 15,000. "Sir, there must be a mistake," Oloku said respectfully, approaching the foreman. "The envelope contains 8,000, but we agreed on 15. Chief Balogun looked at him with the expression of a teacher addressing a slow student. "Did we? Let me explain mathematics to you, my friend. 15,000 minus accommodation costs, minus feeding costs, minus equipment usage fees, minus administrative charges equals 8,000. That is your net pay." The other workers shuffled their feet and examined the ground, but Oloku persisted. Sir, you never mentioned these deductions when you hired us. The accommodation is a shared room with no proper facilities, and the food is barely enough to survive. The foreman's expression hardened like concrete setting in the sun. Are you questioning my accounting? Do you think I am cheating you? Perhaps you would prefer to find work elsewhere? Oloku felt the eyes of 40 desperate men upon him, all of them calculating whether this confrontation might cost them their jobs. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a bushfire. He needed this work, inadequate though it had become. 8,000 naira was still more than farming provided, and he had already been away from home for a month. "No, sir," he said quietly, accepting the envelope. "Thank you for the work." That night, in the suffocating heat of the workers' quarters, Oloku lay awake doing mathematics of survival. 8,000 naira per month meant Falak's surgery would take much longer to afford. It meant Kemi would remain out of school for months more. It meant Aduni would continue to stretch their meager resources while wondering if her husband's sacrifice in Lagos would ever bear fruit. The second month brought new indignities. A worker named Biodun fell from scaffolding and broke his arm when a safety rope that should have been replaced months earlier finally snapped. Instead of providing medical care, Chief Balogan simply dismissed him from the site. "Careless workers are expensive workers," he announced to the remaining crew. "Let this be a lesson about paying attention to your work." Biodun left the site that afternoon, cradling his injured arm and carrying his few possessions in a plastic bag. His month's wages were withheld to cover what the foreman called damages to equipment and lost productivity. None of the workers spoke up, knowing that solidarity might cost them their own desperately needed employment. Food portions grew smaller as Chief Balogan found new ways to reduce costs. The evening meal disappeared entirely, replaced by an announcement that the workers were now responsible for their own dinner. This meant spending money they didn't have at the expensive food vendors outside the construction site or going hungry until morning. Many chose hunger. Oloku began to understand that he was trapped in a system designed to extract maximum work for minimal compensation. Chief Balogan held all the power to fire, the power to withhold wages, the power to extend working hours indefinitely. The workers had only their desperation, which made them willing to accept conditions that no human being should endure. Yet leaving seemed impossible. Returning home empty-handed would mean admitting failure to Aduni and the children. It would mean Folake continuing to suffer with her injured leg while her father proved unable to help her. The shame would be harder to bear than the physical hardship of the construction site. Letters from home made the situation more painful. Aduni wrote in careful handwriting that the rains had failed again and their yam crop was struggling. Kemi was helping neighbors with their farms in exchange for small amounts of food. Folake asked when Papa was coming home and whether he was earning enough money to fix her leg. The letters were full of love and hope that made Oloku's heart ache with guilt. One evening, as he sat outside the workers' quarters watching traffic move along the distant highway, Emeka approached and sat beside him. The thin man who had encouraged him to take the job looked older now, worn down by months of the same treatment. "Brother, I see you thinking too much," Emeka said gently. "This work, it is not what they promised us." Oloku nodded, grateful for someone who understood. "My daughter needs surgery. My family depends on the money I send home. But at this rate—" "I know," Emeka replied. "We all have people depending on us. That is why they can treat us this way. They know we cannot leave." The two men sat in silence, watching the sun set over a city that had promised them opportunity, but delivered only exploitation. In the distance, Lagos glittered with the lights of wealth and possibility, but those lights seemed as far away as stars, beautiful to observe, impossible to reach. As night fell over the construction site, Oloku made a decision that would change everything. He would endure one more month, saving every naira possible. Then, he would confront Chief Balogan about the working conditions, not just for himself, but for all the workers who suffered in silence. The decision felt dangerous and necessary at the same time, like stepping into a rushing river to save a drowning child. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty marketplace of Ikorodu as Oloku adjusted the worn strap of his leather bag. At 42, his weathered hands told the story of decades spent working the land, first as a young boy helping his father, then as a man trying to feed his own family. The bag contained everything he owned of value: a few crumpled naira notes, his identification papers, and a faded photograph of his wife Aduni and their 3 children. Oloku had traveled from his small village in Ogun State with hope burning in his chest, like a carefully tended flame. The promise of work in Lagos had reached even their remote farming community, carried by returning migrants who spoke of construction jobs that paid more in a month than farming yielded in a season. His youngest daughter, Folake, needed surgery for her twisted leg, and the local hospital had quoted an amount that might as well have been the price of the moon. The bus station buzzed with activity as travelers hauled bags and shouted destinations. Oloku found himself swept along with a group of men who looked as desperate and determined as he felt. They spoke in hushed tones about a construction foreman named Chief Balogun who was hiring workers for a new residential complex in Victoria Island. The pay was good, they said, but the work was hard and the boss was harder. "Brother, you look like you can work," said a thin man with kind eyes who introduced himself as Emeka. "Chief Balogun is looking for strong backs, not fancy certificates. If you can carry cement and work in the sun, you can earn." Oloku nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Back home, Aduni was rationing their rice to make it last longer, while their eldest son, Kemi, had dropped out of secondary school to help tend their struggling yam farm. The rains had been unpredictable for 3 seasons running, and their harvest barely fed the family, let alone provided surplus to sell. The journey to the construction site took them through parts of Lagos that Oloku had only heard about in stories. Glass buildings reached toward the sky like the fingers of giants, and cars moved in rivers of metal and noise. The air tasted different here, thick with exhaust and ambition. He pressed his face to the bus window, watching women in colorful wrapper cloths balance impossible loads on their heads while navigating between honking vehicles. When they arrived at the construction site, Oloku's heart sank a little. The half-built structure rose from the earth like a concrete skeleton, surrounded by piles of sand, cement bags, and rusted reinforcement bars. Men in hard hats moved like ants across the framework, their voices echoing off the unfinished walls. The scale of the project was enormous, bigger than anything in his village, bigger than anything he had ever imagined being part of. Chief Balogan stood near a blue container that served as the site office, his substantial belly straining against a dirt-stained polo shirt. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and his small eyes seemed to evaluate each worker like livestock at market. When Oloku's turn came to be assessed, the foreman looked him up and down with calculating precision. "You look strong enough," Chief Balogan declared. "But can you work? This is not village farming where you rest under a tree when the sun gets hot. Here, we work until the job is done, rain or shine. The pay is 15,000 naira per month, but you earn it with sweat and blood. 15,000 naira. The amount echoed in Oloku's mind as he nodded agreement. It was more money than he had ever seen in one place, enough to pay for Folake's surgery and still send some home for the family. He thought of his daughter's brave smile despite the pain in her leg, and felt his resolve strengthen like iron cooling in water. The foreman continued his speech, explaining the rules with the practiced efficiency of a man who had given this speech countless times. Work began at 6 in the morning and ended when the supervisor said it ended. No drinking on site, No fighting, no complaints about the work or the conditions. Payment came at the end of each month, minus deductions for accommodation in the workers' quarters. A long, low building with tin roofing that housed 40 men in bunks that had seen better decades. Oloku was assigned to the concrete mixing crew, a job that involved hauling bags of cement, sand, and gravel from dawn until dusk. His back ached within hours, muscles protesting against the repetitive strain of lifting and pouring. The other workers moved with the rhythm of men who had been doing this work for months or years. Their bodies adapted to the punishment of construction, labor. As the first week progressed, Oloku learned the unspoken rules of survival on the site. Stay quiet and work hard. Don't complain about the long hours or the meager lunch break. Don't question why the promised safety equipment never appeared, or why the water they were given to drink tasted of rust and neglect. Most importantly, don't cross Chief Belogan or his supervisors who wielded their authority like weapons. The workers' quarters became home, though it bore little resemblance to anything Oloku would have called by that name. 40 men crammed into a space meant for half that number, sleeping on thin mattresses that offered little comfort after 12-hour shifts. The single toilet served them all, and the shower was a pipe that delivered cold water for 1 hour each evening. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist in their new world. Yet despite the harsh conditions, Oloku felt something stirring within him that he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Each evening, he calculated his growing earnings, imagining Folake, walking without pain, seeing Kemi return to school, watching Aduni's face light up when he returned home with enough money to change their lives. The work was brutal, but it had purpose beyond mere survival. In the darkness of the quarters, as 40 men snored and shifted on their narrow bunks, Oloku would stare at the ceiling and plan his future. 3 months of this work would give him enough for the surgery. 6 months might allow him to buy better seeds for the farm and maybe a small generator for their home. A year could transform everything, but as he drifted off to sleep on his 7th night in Lagos, Oloku could not have imagined the challenges that would test every ounce of his determination in the weeks to come.